All right, we're back in the mix here in terms of tensions rising once again. What's your take on the latest tariffs?
Well, I think if we can just step back a little bit from the immediate news, to me there are two big differences between the U.S. and China, and it gives China an advantage. Number one is we're a democracy, they are not. Secondly, their idea of short term is 100 years. They have an extremely long time horizon. We have an election coming up next year, and I feel Trump, for two reasons, both for basic economics and secondly to demonstrate his negotiating style, which is one of his main claims to prowess, he's got to produce a deal here. He's got to come up with something that he can call a victory, or he is going to be handing the Democrats a huge selling point in the election, where the economy is one of his strongest calling cards. So I remain optimistic that some kind of deal is going to happen here. And it's not going to be a great deal for the U.S. because, A, the Chinese don't respond to coercion, and secondly, because of their long-term horizon, they can afford to wait it out.
On the other hand, their economy is getting hit pretty hard. They've had inflation problems. They are worried about capital flight, might have to defend their currency at 7. I mean, a lot of people look at the market and the economic reaction and say, the U.S. has the leverage.
Well, that's why I feel there is motivation on both sides to come up with some kind of a deal, but I think we underestimate the pain that the Chinese government is going to be willing to tolerate here in the interest of a long-term advantage. And we do not live in a country like that. That's why it's hard for us to project what the Chinese leadership is thinking, because as I said, we have elections every 4 years. 4 years is like a nanosecond in terms of Chinese history.
I don't understand. So you're saying he needs to have something politically by next election, but they would be unwilling to think on that time. So
No, I think they're willing to give something. Look, they're smart too. They know they have some leverage here, and they have some opportunities. Again, looking back at basic negotiating strategy, which the White House seems to ignore, but nevertheless, it's always been that both sides have to walk away feeling that they gained something. They feel good about a deal. There are things that we can do for the Chinese that I think they truly want, and vice versa, and we should try to hammer that out. But if you think we're going to simultaneously solve the Huawei problem, get them to roll back their protection or their insistence on sharing of technology, on Chinese ownership of ventures there, and buying all this U.S. agricultural products in one fell swoop, I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen.
And have an enforcement mechanism to make sure it all happens, which seems to be a key sticking point at this point as well.
Right. I mean, the Chinese are, I think, most defensive about what looks like the U.S. injecting itself into their sovereignty and telling them what kind of judicial proceedings, what kind of enforcement mechanism, and what kind of laws they need to have to satisfy us. That's a tough one to sell. And again, I've said this before, but history shows that the only trade wars that someone wins are when one side has a huge economic advantage over the other. Like, yes, we can win a trade war with Guatemala, no doubt about it. But China, which again, we have some advantages in terms of the import-export imbalance, but no one's going to end up winning this. So the question is, can you come up with something that both sides can call a victory?
Jim, I want to change subjects quickly here while we have you. You were part of a reporting team for a bizarre story the other day in the Times about Jeffrey Epstein, I guess loosely called a financier, if you want to call him that, of course, who's in jail for a lot of different reasons. But what are you finding there in terms of the continued reporting you're doing on Epstein and his relationship with some very well-known people in the financial community that conceivably could continue to reverberate?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. That first of all, he had not just a brilliant circle of Nobel Prize-winning scientists around him, but like the Nobel Prize-winning equivalents of major investors, some of whom were going to his house, having dinner with him, hailing him as some kind of financial genius. And while I've said he's nowhere near a billionaire, there's no question he's astoundingly wealthy. His lawyers said recently they estimated his net worth at around $500 million. And the question is still hanging out there, where exactly did all this money come from? I mean, he's described himself as a tax expert, as an arbitrage expert, as a foreign currency expert, and yet there's really no evidence to support any of that.
Whatsoever. I mean, in all the years that I've been covering hedge funds or people who make investments, he never once crossed my path in any way. But I have heard that he did help people with their tax planning and their estates and things like that. Do you think it's possible that down the road, given these sizable holdings he seemed to have offshore and the commingling of funds that some of you have reported on, that there'll be some investigation as to whether this was legal?
Well, there's got to be some investigation. I mean, if I'm assistant U.S. attorney sitting in the Southern District of Manhattan right now, I would be all over this. And again, look at the tax strategy. Let's concede maybe he is a tax expert. There are many tax experts sitting, within a stone's throw of us on Wall Street, and how many of them have $500 million? What tax strategy could conceivably have generated for him that kind of income? It simply does not make any sense. And when you show me a giant pile of money like that, a shifty character who we now have demonstrated is a serial illusionist, as we said in our story, and I'm an investigator, I would be all over this thing. Well, and as a journalist, I'm trying.
Right. I mean, we look forward to, further reporting from you and the team there, and others as well,
Yeah,
because it is a disturbing but interesting story.